Hi, I'm Susan Wise-Bauer, co-author of The Well-Trained Mind.
And I'm Susanna Jarrett, editor at the Well-Trained Mind Press, and we're talking about education for all parents and for all children in all sorts of settings.
And I am so excited to see Susanna because, of course, you guys will be listening to this a little bit later than we're recording it. But as we're recording it, Susanna is just back from maternity leave. Yay! Tell the world about your baby, Susanna.
I have a beautiful little baby girl. I could talk about her all day, so I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but she's been wonderful. She's the baby everyone is telling me tricks you into having a second baby, which we'll see how that goes. But my husband and I are enjoying her so much. It's just quite the experience.
Susanna's been sending the most beautiful pictures, and we are so glad that she was able to take maternity leave. And also, I'm so glad that you're back because I missed having these conversations with you.
Well, I'm actually very happy to be back. I love my daughter and I love looking at her beautiful face all day, but it is nice to kind of be back in the grind and having conversations about things that are important and feel a lot more relevant now that I have my own child and I'm really thinking about homeschooling. Everything is just, there's a new light on it. Let's put it that way.
Oh, and this is going to be, you guys are all going to benefit from Susanna's journey through parenting.
The real-time journey of me preparing for homeschool.
Exactly, because as you may remember, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, Susanna was homeschooled, so she brings that experience to the table. But it's going to be just so exciting to walk through the next phase with you. So today, we're going to talk about something that you will eventually experience, I think, if you decide to homeschool, and that is something that I don't think gets enough attention, and that is outside pressures on homeschoolers. And I called this episode, this was my title, The Outside Gaze, because, that's a thing that comes up a lot when we're talking. I mean, I'll speak for myself, talking about your life as a woman. Often you're trying to distinguish this outside gaze, what other people expect of you, what other people need from what your own internal motivations are. And that's a real phenomenon for home educators as well. I mean, I know I started homeschooling in very large part, having been homeschooled myself, because I didn't want our family life controlled by an outside school schedule.
Right.
I honestly could not imagine getting my kids to school at the same time every single day. We live on a farm, so we got a lot of space. I had four very different children, and I wanted to teach them in a way that was right for us. I wanted to be able to tailor progress to their strengths, spend extra time on weaknesses, and just generally chart an individual course, both for each one of them and for us as a family. And I do think that's a motivation for a lot of home educators.
Right.
But what we sometimes don't stop to recognize or talk about is that while we're doing our own thing, there's always a lot of pressure on us from other people. That's the outside gaze. So today I want to talk with you, Susanna, about pressure we feel from other people who are maybe outside of our family system to structure our homeschooling in 3 very particular ways. And what's the first one?
So our first one that we're talking about today is the most general, which is peer pressure when homeschooling. And I love this term that you've brought into this episode, the outside gaze, because I think that's such a great way of encapsulating these 3 things that we're talking about, starting with peer pressure, in that you have this beautiful vision, like you described, this beautiful course that you're charting for your family. But then these things come that add a lot of hardship to the homeschool experience. And I hope that as we talk through these 3 things, we can take some of that pressure off of parents. Because even though I'm not homeschooling yet, just even being a mom, I had this vision of motherhood. And even that has been a little tainted by allowing noise in from this is how you should be doing this. This is how you should be doing that. And everything from how to hold your baby's legs while you're changing their diaper to how to hold the carrier of your car seat. There is a right way to do it on Instagram. And it's a lot. So anyway, peer pressure is our first one. And especially with homeschooling, where you're kind of going off the beaten path, I think it can be very difficult to ignore judgment coming from many different directions. There could be judgment from older relatives. There could be judgment from your homeschooling peers about how to homeschool. There could be pressure from friends, which is really hard to navigate.
And when I started homeschooling my kids, believe it or not, there was no such thing as social media. And But social media introduces its whole new wrinkle in that even if
Yes.
people aren't judging you directly, you look at their pictures and their posts and what they're doing, and you think to yourself, well, why doesn't my homeschool look like that?
Yes.
And it's very easy to get into this very self-critical mode, which doesn't actually come from yourself.
Right.
It comes from you looking at what other people are doing and then turning that into a gaze on yourself. That's another kind of outside gaze.
Right. And the internet and social media, there's another type of judgment where, again, like you're saying, it's not explicit. And I'm feeling this as a young mom. The motherhood space and the homeschool space are kind of connected on Instagram.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people, and it's important to remember this, that are selling you an online course or selling you their consultant services. And so they have all these great ideas about this is the best way to do this. This is the right way to do that. And it's popping up in your feed and it's becoming noise in your head of like, I don't pick up my baby's car seat that way every time, know, and it can seem like silly little things, but it adds up. And it's important to remember that they are selling a product. They're selling you their how to homeschool course, or they're selling you this, that, or the other. So they have to establish that they know something you don't know about homeschooling. So there's a little pressure built in to those types of social media posts.
That's a really good observation. And it's important. So tiny rabbit trail on social media posts. If you follow someone on Instagram or on Twitter or on Facebook, you should, I'm sorry, we're supposed to call it X now, whatever that's about. You always should ask yourself who is benefiting from this post. Who is selling something? What do they want me to do? And what are they getting out of it?
Right.
I mean, this kind of pressure has always been there. I know that when my mother decided in 1972 to pull us out of school and teach us at home, and she told my grandparents about it, they cried.
Oh, no.
They were so concerned for what was going to happen to us, right? No, what are you doing? So that's outside pressure, but that's family outside pressure. And now that outside gaze has just gotten so much more pervasive and so much bigger. So I would say, we talked about this in the dealing with burnout episode, Susanna, that the more you sort of open yourself up to that outside gaze, I think the easier it is to become discouraged or frantic.
Yeah. And if you haven't listened to our episode, it's episode 8 on dealing with burnout. That's one thing that we talk about and offer some strategies. But hopefully in this episode, we can talk about some ways to break free from that pressure before it gets to that state of leading to burnout, because it can do that pretty quickly, make you discouraged and burnt out. But you've talked about, and I would love to get your stories on identifying this type of noise in your life, things that are causing you stress.
Well, Susanna, if I could just go back for a minute to your experience as a young mom, I remember there were when my kids were really, really little, when I had newborns, there were 2 books that were sort of making the rounds. And one of them was by a couple called the Ezzos, who really recommended scheduling your baby very, very strictly. And everybody that I knew who was a young mom had the Ezzos book. I think it was called Baby Wise. Anyway, their book was not just about scheduling your baby. It was about how scheduling your baby in this particular way was the right moral and godly thing to do, right? So it brought in that whole sort of hierarchy of values into whether or not you get your baby up and put your baby down at the same time every day. This was really, it wasn't just a choice. It was something that God wanted you to be really clear about.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, there was a second book, and it was called My First 300 Babies. And it was by a nurse who her job was to come into a home after, a mom had a baby and help the mom help the mom with newborns. Some mom had other kids. They needed help. That book actually recommended a lot of the same things, but it was very much, here's how you do this. Here's a practical way to do it. If you do it, you'll be able to sleep. Sleeping is good. But there wasn't any of that sort of sense of condemnation if you chose to do it a different way.
Yeah.
So the most dangerous noise is the noise that says, you are ruining your child. You are displeasing God. Your child will never get into college. It's sort of, fear-based noise. And look, there's a lot of it out there because there's a lot of anxiety among homeschool parents as to whether or not we're doing it right, because we don't have really objective, I would say that they're even in public education, objective measures of how kids are actually doing are few and far between. But we don't have any way to say to ourselves, yes, we're doing a good job. So the kinds of noise that I think are the most destructive are the ones that tell you that something bad is going to happen. If you don't do things in a certain way, or that you're going to displease whatever ethic, whether, I'm a Christian, so for me, it would be God, but whatever ethic is sort of undergirds your way of life, you are displeasing that or you're breaking it. And this isn't always, sometimes it's about schedules. A lot of times it's about behavior.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's about curricula. And I remember there was a time we have really active user forums at welltrainedmind.com with tons and tons and tons of homeschool parents posting. I remember there was a time about 15 years ago when I had to go on the forums and tell people to stop talking about math.
Oh no, what happened?
Well, I mean, anyone who was back on the forums in that day, and maybe we'll get some comments from those of you who remember this, they still call it the math wars. People were so heated about what method to use to teach math that a mom would be like, I'm using this math curriculum for my kid. And immediately 20 people would jump on and tell her why that was the worst idea ever. And her kids would never manage to graduate from high school. And they certainly wouldn't do well enough in the SATs to get into college. And I mean, it was just insanity. Like the level, that outside gaze that homeschool moms were directing to each other.
Right.
Was craziness.
And that makes me think that could be a good gauge now, whether you're on the forums or on Instagram or whatever social media you use, for content that is uplifting you versus bringing this noise in. Is like, does this account that I'm following have that sense of, or that attitude of, this is the way, or your child will suffer? Or is it more just helpful, positive, supportive content? Because both exist in the same sphere, and we kind of have to create that distinction for ourselves when we're choosing who to follow.
Yeah. And, I would say that here at the Well-Trained Mind, one of the things that we have always held up as a really core value is us saying, look, here's how we think grammar should be taught. We think you should diagram. We think history should be chronological. But you know what? If you decide to do it another way, and that's good for your family, go you. Your mileage may vary. So I love that. I love that idea, Susanna, as maybe the first way to deal with this sort of peer pressure is, really ask yourself of the accounts that you follow. Do they give you good ideas and make you feel encouraged, or do they make you feel condemned and fearful?
Right. And it could be condemned and fearful in different ways. It could be because the image they're putting out is so perfect and so curated that that you're comparing. But anyway, I think that would be a good, I'm going to do that. I'm going to sweep through my Instagram and see what are these accounts that are dragging me down versus lifting me up. But we have some other ideas as well for breaking free from that peer pressure. And I think one that is so important is just to go back to the basics with what is your why? Every homeschool family, no one's doing it because someone told you to. Homeschooling is a massive endeavor. And so we all have our reasons, our well thought out reasons for taking this step. And to come back to that, even if it means getting yourself a cup of tea and sitting down and journaling out all those things that brought you to homeschooling in the first place, coming back to that why is such a great grounding when you're starting to feel that pressure.
I'm going to go on a complete and total rabbit trail and recommend something that has nothing to do with homeschooling at all. And that is The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, which is sort of a classic among writers and, sort of struggling artistic types, because the whole point of this book, which has been around for a long time, people work through it multiple times. I think I've been through it twice, is finding your path rather than trying to follow other people's paths. And even if you're not a writer or an artist or creative person, so much of what she covers in that book could really apply to your educational journey, because when you're teaching your kids at home, you are creating something.
Right.
You're creating a way of life. You're creating an environment within which these kids can flourish. So, I'm not actually getting any referral points for this, but I would highly recommend having a look at that, skim through it, skip the parts that don't apply to you. But she has these great journal exercises about finding out what your goal is and what your purposes are for the enterprise that you're undertaking, that I just think are so incredibly valuable.
That's awesome. I will link that or write it down in the show notes so folks can find that book. Another book I would recommend is I'm going to plug your book, Rethinking School, because I found it's a great book. Whether you're reading it for the first time or you're coming back to it, when you start to question yourself as a parent, Rethinking School by Susan Wise Bauer goes through a lot of options for helping you find your way to advocate for your child, whether that's in the school system or homeschooling, and there's some exercises in there too that can kind of help you get back to that. This is me. This is my parenting journey. How can I do the best for my kid in a non-judgmental way? So I would recommend Rethinking School as well if you're getting there.
And I appreciate that. We have actually talked a lot about social media, and we're going to get back to this a little later on in the episode. Obviously, this takes place in homeschool support groups as well. Some support groups are not support groups. They're condemnation groups. And if you're having that feeling when you go to your support group, you need to stop going.
Yeah.
Pick the one or two people out of that group that you really have a connection with and make play dates with them, go for coffee, but skip the support group. If it's making you feel that you're not good enough, that you're anxious, that you've got to keep changing curricula, then that isn't a place that you should be. There's this concept. It's called good enough parenting.
Okay.
Are you familiar with this, Susanna?
I have not heard of good enough parenting. Tell me about good enough parenting.
Good enough parenting means that you are providing your kids with a safe, stable, loving home environment besides all the things that you mess up. And that if you're providing them with a safe, stable, loving, home environment, that you guys are all going to be okay. You don't have to have everything figured out. And in fact, you won't have everything figured out. But whenever you're in an environment where you find yourself sort of minutely examining everything that you're doing to find out if it's good enough, you're in this cycle that's ultimately destructive. So instead of best parenting practices, we talk about good enough parenting practices. And I think the same is true with educating our kids at home. They're never going to do exactly what we wanted them to do, right?
Yeah.
Are they thriving? That's the question to ask yourself. If they're doing fine and they're happy and they're doing their work and then they run out and play, stop chasing a better solution. And a lot of times a support group can become a place where instead of being told that you're doing fine and the kids are fine, which is support, you're told, well, they could be doing better.
Yeah.
If you just switched to this program. So you end up doing a lot of curricula switching in order to chase the best instead of that good enough, which I am a real fan of good enough parenting and good enough education.
Yes, that can be such an amazing comfort. What comes to mind, and I'm so in this new mom headspace that I'm going to be making more analogies, but we had a lactation consultant at the beginning with the baby who my baby was gaining weight, was doing okay. We were enjoying nursing. It was a good experience for both of us. But I saw a lactation consultant who, again, needs me to have a problem in order for me to keep coming to see her, but just made me feel horrible. Like I was doing it all. It wasn't quite perfect. I didn't have quite the perfect feed, and she could have been eating more. And she even said, well, yeah, she's growing, but she could be off the charts growing. And
oh no, Susanna, I'm so sorry.
I got home and now I'm crying, trying to feed my baby. She won't get on just right. And I'm taking her off and put her on. And it turned something that was enjoyable and natural for me into a every 2 hours just struggle fest. And so eventually I talked to my mom and she was like, she just took the pressure off of me. Just enjoy it. Just go back to what feels right. And you know what? My baby is still growing. She's fine. Is she in the 99th percentile? No, but she's okay. And that just reminds me of good enough parenting. I'm not doing everything right, but I'm enjoying my experience with my baby.
Good enough nursing.
Good enough nursing, good enough parenting. That is such a good term.
Yep. I love that. I love that story. I mean, I'm sorry that you went through it, but I love that story as an illustration of exactly what we're looking at.
Right.
When you are, and we're really here, we're talking about peer pressure that comes from several different directions. It can come from social media. It can come from your family. It can come from your friends. It can come from your support group. Another Another phrase that I learned from reading our forums is pass the bean dip.
What does this mean?
Okay, so what this means is when someone says to you, so what percentile are your kids in on their math programs and what are you using? Because I have some great ideas for you. You say, oh, that's such a lovely thought. Where's the bean dip? Okay, so you can set up boundaries for yourself,
Right.
and you do not have to answer all questions, or you don't have to defend yourself. That's really what pass the bean dip means. It means I'm not going to engage in this conversation.
Yeah.
We're fine. Let's do something else that might be mutually fun. Personally, I don't like bean dip, but I get the reference there. I had recently somebody that posted on one of my social media channels that said, whenever I meet a family that's homeschooling, the thing I really need to know before I get to know them better is, why are you homeschooling? I really need them to explain that. And I said, I wouldn't explain that to you.
Yeah.
If you're somebody who needs to know, I mean, I have a feeling that what they were looking for was some sort of either political or theological statement. If you can't be my friend without demanding to know why I have made certain choices for my family, no, thank you.
Yeah.
You're not going to be part of my inner circle.
Pass the bean dip.
Pass the bean dip.
Yeah, that one I feel like takes practice. Such a practical piece of advice.
Oh, it does.
But it is easier said than done to not justify when someone's coming at you or even subtly implying that you should explain yourself in a certain way. It's just going to take practice, but can release a lot of pressure once you get used to the idea that I do not need to justify my decisions for my family to every person that I meet.
Yeah. And I think that the younger that you are, the harder it is. Because when you're younger, and particularly, I think, Susanna, you and I were both raised in pretty conservative Christian circles, you're used to feeling like you have to give an account for yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, now that I'm in my mid-50s, I'm like, I don't owe you an explanation for anything. Thank you very much. So it does take time and it takes courage, but maybe it's something that our listeners could keep in mind.
Yeah.
When somebody is asking you to defend what you're doing, that is peer pressure. And you don't have to give into it.
Right. I love that.
And we'll be right back.
The Well-Trained Mind Academy, founded by Susan Weisbauer, offers live online instruction and classical teaching methods that fit your students' educational plan. Our instructors are highly qualified in their fields and have years of experience in teaching, tutoring, and homeschooling. We work closely with students, parents, and instructors to create an educational environment that fits the needs of each family. From calculus to Japanese to essay writing to medieval history, the Well-Trained Mind Academy offers 150 courses for grades 5 through 12. Visit WTMacademy.com to learn more.
One thing that I think a lot of people feel pressured to be a part of, and I think you can speak to this maybe, Susan, is homeschooling groups and homeschooling co-ops.
Yes. Those of you who have listened to me speak before will know how I feel about co-ops, possibly. So we'll talk about why I am not a fan of co-ops. But I think where I'd want to start is in my interactions with homeschool parents, many of them, and I'm talking about from beginners up to long timers, tell me about how the co-op they're really struggling with the co-op. It's stressing them out. It's stressing their kids out. It's not really working for them. And their motivation for being in the co-op seems to be that everybody else is in it, right? All the other homeschoolers they know are in it, or they've been told, for classical education in particular, this is the best / only way to do classical education is to be part of this co-op, so that they're missing out if they don't join in. That's another manifestation of what I would call that outward gaze. It sounds great. I mean, the word co-op sounds so, I don't know, inclusive, supportive, but in practical terms, that's often not the case.
Right. So let's talk about co-ops, what they are, and do I need to be in one? A co-op, just for those who aren't familiar with the term, because it's a bit of homeschool jargon, I guess, is loosely defined just a group of homeschooling families who collaborate or cooperate on teaching and learning together. So it can vary wildly from a very loose group of families who get together once a month to do a field trip, to a very tight-knit group where they offer formal classes in subjects. One parent teaches math and one teaches science, and you get live classes once a week, and there's attendance requirements and homework assignments. So it can be that and everything in between. It's a very broad term, but I think, like you were saying, we both have different experiences with co-ops. I've never been part of a super structured one, but I've been part of lots of unstructured ones where maybe a mom just taught one class because she really had a passion in teaching that class, and another mom taught a different elective like art or cooking. So anyway, co-op is a very broad term for families getting together to homeschool together.
Yep, absolutely. And again, this sounds great in theory, but I think you and I have both had personal experiences with co-ops, which have not turned out wonderfully. So I'll start with mine, and then I'm going to push it over to you. I was only in a co-op once because I had 4 children under the age of 10, and I thought, okay, I knew I wasn't doing a good job teaching science, and the co-op had a science class, so I was like, oh, this is something we need to do. And my mother, bless her, said to me, this is not a good idea. This is not going to be a good use of your time. And I said, oh, well, I'm going to try it anyway. Lo and behold, what happened at this particular co-op was that we were all swapping duties, and I was teaching at the college level at the College of William and Mary at the time. And so I taught a high school literature and writing class, and my kids took science classes. That was the trade-off. Well, what happened was that I spent a huge amount of my time and effort grading high school papers and providing feedback, and my kids painted styrofoam balls to look like planets. So it was not a good trade-off. And afterwards, I thought, if I had just taken all that time that I spent doing co-op teaching and invested it directly in my kids, we'd have been so much better off. And then I also found that, that just the time pressures of getting 4 young children into the van meant that on co-op mornings, we were rushed and we were busy and we were hassled. And I remember my third son, who was probably only 4 at the time, one co-op morning just collapsing onto the floor in tears because he didn't do hurry. He didn't do rush. He couldn't cope with it. Right. And I was trying to rush him along. And I thought, what am I doing? Yeah. This was supposed to enrich us. And it's stressing the whole family out. But I had kind of gotten sucked into this, well, they can be taught by real science teachers and you're not a real science teacher. That was my peer pressure.
Right. The pressure that someone could do it, something
better
that you couldn't do. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a few experiences with co-ops as well. The first one was also, we were going to be in a science class and a PE class. And we, very similar to you, there was a lot of pressure to get out of the house, and my mom didn't get us there every time, and she didn't get us there on time every time. But we had this PE class where, for whatever reason, it was all boys except for me and my 3 sisters. And the teacher of the class, I guess, believed that girls couldn't play basketball. I'm not sure what was going on, but every week that we weren't there, him and the boys would just play basketball the whole PE class. But if we came, we had to play kickball. So the boys, you can imagine, were not big fans of me and my sisters, and were not very nice about it, because every time we came, it was like, oh, they're here. Now we have to play kickball. So it wasn't a very fun experience from a student perspective. I think eventually we kind of told our mom, we are not going back to there. But it sounded good in theory. We're going to get some socialization, get some science, get some PE. But in theory, there were already these, groups of kids. It was already just a lot. Maybe my sister's first experience of being bullied, which was not pleasant.
Oh no.
And then our second co-op I was so excited about. I was in high school. I was ready to start kind of comparing my ideas with my parents' ideas and figuring out what I believed. And there was a co-op that offered a worldview class. And I was excited about being able to kind of debate and talk about ideas with other people that were outside of my family. But we got kicked out after the first day because I didn't believe in young earth theory, and that somehow came out in the worldview class. And so we got kicked out of that co-op. So those are my...
Did they actually tell you not to come back?
Yes.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Not me. They told my mom that we were not welcome. But so those were my experiences in school. I actually had one positive experience with the co-op as well.
Oh, good. I think that we need one at this point.
Yes. So my positive experience was in high school. I was teaching my younger siblings geography because I love geography. And my mom was teaching some other homeschool kids. So they joined the class and then their friends joined. And it kind of grew into this big geography class that I ran just for fun. And so once a month we get together and the kids would each do a presentation on a country from the region we were doing. So if we were doing the Middle East, one kid would have a presentation about Iran and another kid would have a presentation about Iraq. And there ended up being like 15 to 20 kids that they had to do a board and then they had to either have a game or food or something interactive from their country.
Nice.
So we'd get together, they would do their presentations, we would eat a bunch of food from that region, we would play games from that region, and then I would have some lesson about, for the older kids, about maybe types of government or something of that nature that I prepared beforehand. But it was so much fun. That was just all it was. It was just geography, but it became a really, really joyful thing for me and for my family's friends.
So it can be a good thing.
Yes, it can be.
So I guess what we really need to think about here is the motivations, as with so many things in life.
Right.
If it's going to reduce your stress level and free you up to do more useful things, if it's something you genuinely enjoy, right. Susanna? Or if you can hand off a subject that you actually don't enjoy or can't teach well, then those are all good motivations, but there are also bad motivations.
Right. And that comes back to what we talked about before with starting with your why. Maybe sit down and be really honest with yourself. Am I doing it just because everyone else is doing it? Am I doing it because there's a group that is promising to be the best way to homeschool? Because there may be more organized co-ops who are kind of putting that pressure on. Or am I doing it because, as Susan, you mentioned before, because I'm worried that my kids are going to miss something? We want to avoid those decisions made just out of fear and peer pressure and everyone else is doing it. So be honest with ourselves as we're making this decision about whether or not to be in a co-op. And if you're in a co-op and you hate every Friday that you have to go and it's so much stress and there's not really any great reason to be in it, just leave. Give yourself the permission to just go.
I know. I love that so much. And, I think one of the things that I did not learn until I was too old, I wish I'd learned it earlier, is that no is a complete sentence. That's one of my favorite sayings in the world. No is a complete sentence. If you decide you don't want to do the co-op and people are like, but all of the wonderful things and everybody's in it and all of this great stuff is happening. And in your heart that this is not the right, way for your family, is you just say, yeah, but no.
Yeah.
Pass the bean dip.
Right. We're right back where we started with peer pressure about learning how to say no, learning that you don't have to justify yourself. If anybody has, I know this is probably just a time and practice thing, but if anyone has like books they've read or workbooks they've worked through to help support that process of being able to just say no, send them to me. Send us at podcast@welltrainedmind.com. We can post them in the show notes, some resources people have used to get better at this, because it's hard. It's really hard, but it's such a key.
It is difficult, but that's, I feel like as we are parents, we're learning how to be grownups. And there's so many parts of parenting where you're like, oh, wait, I have to actually be a grownup about this now. And saying no and saying, no, I'm not going to do this thing that everyone else is doing because it's not right for us is a really big part of that.
Yeah.
And, that kind of brings us to our third point here, which is a lot of people homeschool because they actually want their children to develop that ability. They don't want their children to follow their peers. They want to avoid putting children under what we call peer pressure.
Right.
Until they're old enough, mature enough, settled enough to know what they want. And, part of the whole co-op discussion is I have often said to parents, look, you took your kids out of school so that they wouldn't be subject to peer pressure. And now you're giving into it. Because you don't really want to be part of this, but everybody else is. So you feel like you have to.
Right.
So taking your kids out of school often is an attempt to avoid peer pressure. And then, what everybody then on the outside, that outside gaze says to you is they say, what about Socialization.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. And, I think anybody who's homeschooled for more than 6 months,
Right.
I'm going to say more than 3 months,
Probably
has had
fair.
somebody say, what about socialization?
This is right up there with the most asked question of homeschoolers with, can you do school in your pajamas? It's these two that I heard my entire childhood, which the answer to the pajamas question was a resounding no for me and my family, which didn't seem fair, but that's how it was.
Well, I can understand that. It's important to, okay, I'm sorry, total rabbit trail, but I was reading this article in the New York Times this morning about one of the disadvantages to working at home is that when you work at home, you don't have that liminal space between home and work, which is your commute, where you leave one state and enter into another. So I think changing out of your pajamas is that same thing. It says we're going to do something different now.
Yeah. No, I believe in it now. I'm a fan. I obviously I work from home and I need that too, that setting of space and that getting ready for the day. But socialization, to get back to it before I take us down too far, it was that other question, which I'm not sure I had as clear of an answer to growing up, but that I feel a lot stronger about now.
So if we were to define socialization, this is one of those words. It's like one of my personal peeves when people use the word woke. I want to say, okay, stop that and tell me what you mean, because it's a word that can mean very different things depending on the person using it.
Right.
Socialization is literally learning the norms and values and behaviors of the society in which you live. I guess one might paraphrase that as not being a weirdo. And yes, I would 100% agree that it's important to be able to function smoothly in different social situations. But I guess the first question I would ask is, how many norms and values of the society that we live in do you actually want your kids to internalize?
Right. If you really think about the way that you want to raise your children, do you want to give them more freedom than what they might pick up with that peer pressure, with the cliques, with all that stuff that comes in a school environment, which I think it's important to note is not the only social environment where they can grow and learn those cultural norms and learn those societal norms so they don't stick out like a sour thumb in every social situation. I think we think about school as the way to do that, but it's helpful to remember that schools have functioned in many different ways for a long time. The way we do school now is pretty modern. You talk about that in Rethinking School, another reason why I recommend that book for folks worried about these questions. But school is not the only social environment, and it's oftentimes not the most helpful. You talked about, learning how to socialize means variety. It means you have to know how to act in different situations. And school is a very, very specific social environment where students are divided into classes by age, which is not going to be recreated at any other point in their life after school.
Once you get out of school, you are never going to be in that position again. So how is school teaching kids how to survive in the real world when it puts them in this incredibly artificial setting that they will never encounter once they grow up?
Right. And
that's what you tell people who question your decision to homeschool.
That's a good answer. And there's a lot for that quality socialization, for knowing how to act in different situations. You need variety. You need to learn how to talk to a variety of people, meaning people of different age groups. That's a big part of it. And when you're in a school environment, you're interacting with one teacher and a whole bunch of kids your age. So it's not the most natural environment. But another thing I think that's important to think about is that there's a lot of different places that you can socialize. It's not just school. There's an article that answers this question on our website, welltrainedmind.com, that says there are many agents of socialization: family, religious groups, clubs, sports, tutors and mentors, arts, travel, jobs, the media, civic participation. There's so many different ways to socialize. And I think when you do meet those like weird homeschoolers, because, they're out there giving us a bad name, right?
I have no idea what you're talking about, Susanna.
I think that comes not from the child not going to school, but from the child not leaving the home or socializing in a group outside the family at all. It's not necessarily that school isn't happening. It's that there's a myriad of other social opportunities that child isn't being exposed to. So it is important for our children to be socialized, but school is not the only way to do that.
Or even necessarily, as we've said, the primary way, because it's so artificial, right?
Right.
And Susanna, you had an interesting thought about reading.
Yeah, because I was homeschooled and I never felt, in some ways, I was actually very, my childhood was very, what's the word I'm looking for? Sheltered.
Sheltered?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was very sheltered. But when I got out into the real world, went to college, I never really felt that out of place because I read so many books and stories. And then I recently read this article that said that children who read end up, it seems to be, there's more research coming out that can help them develop social skills and emotional skills like empathy, encouraging tolerance. And so I think that when we read stories, we're putting ourselves in other people's shoes, we're putting ourselves in these situations. It can actually be a way of socializing us in some ways. Not to say that you can give your kids books instead of taking them outside. It can't be a replacement for others, but I think it can actually support and strengthen children to have all of these wonderful stories about people who are in hard situations and figured out what to do. When they do go out into the real world, they'll take those with them. So I think reading is a really cool and special part of that socializing. Although I would say again, not the only way to socialize your children. They still need to experience that themselves.
But maybe one that we haven't paid enough attention to.
Right. I think it's a really great resource. The more kids are reading stories about other people and, people who are like them, people who are not like them, people from different countries, people who have different experiences in them, they're building those social emotional skills that are so important.
So I think we can talk about under socialization, but those would be students who are really isolated within the home.
Yeah.
Right. And that can be a toxic situation. It can be even an abusive situation, and that is a terrible thing for children. It is a terrible thing for families. I would venture to say that if a child is in a family situation where they are incredibly isolated at home, even if they are in school, socialization is not happening because they're only getting two different settings. They're getting the home setting, which is clearly dysfunctional, and then they're getting the classroom setting, which is very, very limited.
Right.
They're still not getting the opportunity to interact with different people in different situations. And that's really what socialization should be about.
Right.
Having the chance to get out and see different people of different ages doing different things in different settings.
Right. Yes, that's a better way of putting what I was saying before about when you see or meet children who seem maybe under socialized, school is not that deciding factor. It may be that they're just not getting out in all the different ways that children need to be socialized in a variety of settings. So I think we have to take that pressure off when people question us. Well, first of all, now I know you don't have to justify yourself.
Yes, that's very true.
But if you feel the need to.
Yeah. So I think you had some personal experience with this, Susanna.
Yeah, I had a friend. So I was homeschooled. I loved being homeschooled. Even though we were sheltered, we met kids in the neighborhood. We went to church. We went to community activities. I volunteered. There's always things that I could do where I was meeting people of different ages. I did have a friend who was homeschooled for a short time, and she was she was kind of pulled out of school to be protected, I guess, in a sense from school itself, but both of her parents worked full time and she didn't have any siblings. So she was at home alone all day in her house, no parents at home, as an 8th grader. So in middle school, when she was kind of figuring herself out and going through all of those things that you go through in middle school. And it was a really rough time for her. And she's okay now, but I would not recommend just leaving your kids home alone all day to homeschool them, because that is going to make them feel really, really lonely and maybe insecure about being able to make friends and maintain relationships.
And, I have said this before, and you know what, Susanna, we were thinking, by the way, all of you people out there in podcast land, for our 3rd season of doing sort of contentious issues. I know, right? Big fights in homeschooling. And I would really love for us to have a much more in-depth discussion about how homeschooling and abusive parenting do and don't feed off of each other, because anybody who follows my Facebook page, for example, will know that I took exception a while ago to, there was a whole series of Washington Post articles about homeschooling, which were just unremittingly negative. And every single one of them was highlighting a family situation that was deeply deeply toxic. And homeschooling was part of that family situation in each one of these stories that they chose to highlight. But as I read through them, I thought, it wouldn't have mattered if the kid had been in school because the family situation was so bad that the abuse would have continued. So, one thing I would like us to talk about is to what extent is homeschooling related or not related to these sort of like deeply isolationist tendencies in unhappy families, because it is certainly not an inevitable connection.
Right. And I think that's where that guttural reaction I always felt to the, well, what about socialization question is because it feels like it's equating homeschooling with some type of parent abuse, which doesn't feel
or
fair.
neglect.
Or neglect. Is maybe a better word. Yeah.
And I mean, I think, so something else I want us to do, Susanna, maybe this will be for our 4th season, is we need to start doing movie reviews. I think we should watch both of the Mean Girls movies, the old one and the new one, because both of them have really different takes on what it means for a homeschooled student to suddenly return to the public school environment, which I think that could be kind of fun.
That could be fun. I was in the middle of Mean Girls when I gave birth.
Have you gotten back to it yet?
So I haven't finished it. So
okay.
Well, happy memories with that one.
Okay. All right. So we'll get back to that. Anyway, what brings that to mind is just the reality that a classroom environment can also just result in such negative social experiences, cliques, peer pressure. And, as soon as my experience, and this is part of my issue with co-ops, I guess, is as soon as you get 5 or 6 kids together, you have cliques and categories. And people get categorized as the smart one or the popular one or the jock or whatever. You've got, as soon as you get a certain number of kids together, you have what is potentially bad socialization, where they feel like they've got to either adopt or reject a category in order to say who they are.
Right. And I think there's some freedom in not exposing your children to these kind of limiting beliefs about how they have to categorize them or what their possibilities are for when they grow up. Even I feel like, Susan, your life is kind of an example of this, in the sense that if someone had asked you when you were 10, like, what do you want to do when you grow up? And you said, well, I want to homeschool 4 children and write successful books and be a professor and start businesses. And they would say, well, you have to choose one of those things. You know what I mean? But as homeschoolers, we don't have to be limited to that some of the socialization of just how life works and how work works. My brother-in-law asked recently when we were talking to him about homeschooling, well, if your kids don't homeschool, how are they going to learn how to wake up and go to a job they hate every day from 8 to 5,
Oh no. Was that a serious question?
That's not quite how he phrased it, but it was kind of like, they need the character to wake up and go to work, and nobody likes doing that. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, me and my siblings, we all have different jobs, and none of us go to an office, but we've all been successful in our different fields and have never felt like, that was one of my brothers is an entrepreneur, and one of my sisters started a nonprofit. But there's some limiting beliefs I think you can pick up in that system that I feel like homeschoolers have the opportunity to be free from.
Yeah. And I would just, as the parent now of 4 adult children, and Susanna and I both had life passages. Susanna had a baby, and my youngest child graduated from college.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So, just watching them chart these really individual different paths, I'm seeing them all try something and be like, not quite right, pivot. Try something, not quite right, pivot, in a really healthy, energetic way, looking for the right thing and not feeling like they're stuck, not feeling like they've already been pigeonholed. They've already been put on a path that they can't get off of. And, isn't that what we all want? Just to sort of like bring this to a close. An outside gaze is always trying to push you onto someone else's path. Always.
Yeah.
Whether it's, and it might be really well-intentioned, but whether it's your friend's idea or your parents' idea or your, relatives of other relatives' idea, or whether it's your homeschool group's idea, it's not your idea. And we should have the courage to push that outside gaze away. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be accountable to people. Look, as you guys know from listening to me, I'm a fan of standardized testing, not a fan of standardized testing as an industry, but I'm a fan of standardized testing for parents and kids so that you have some sort of idea that you're covering the basics. This is important. Kids should be educated. I have never once advocated not registering as a homeschooler or not following your county regulations, because I think accountability is important. But what's also important is that you are following a path and showing your kids how to follow their path, not someone else's.
Right. And I think that there's no better way to close out than just to reiterate that courage that you keep talking about, developing that courage to allow you and your children to chart the path that is best for you and your family. That is really encouraging for me at the beginning of my parenting journey. And so thank you for sharing all of your insights today.
I'll repeat it to you on a regular basis.
Thank you. And with that, we will close this episode. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on classical education, home education, school education, or any kind of education that interests you. You can reach us at podcast@welltrainedmind.com. Thanks for listening.